All right, I'm going to assume that you have already followed the instructions to install R and RStudio locally on your computer, and then you should be able to go and open RStudio like you would any other program on your computer. So for me, I have it in my dock, and so I can just click on it and it will launch like this. And the very first thing that I want you to do is to create a new project. So we're going to go up to the File menu and we're going to select New Project. So RStudio is going to ask us if we want to use a new directory or an existing directory. And if you already have a folder for this class, maybe you have a file system where you make a folder for the semester, and then within that you have a folder for the class, you can say existing directory. If you don't have a folder for this class yet, you pick new directory. Directory just means folder. So I'm going to pick new directory. And then I want to say that it's going to be a new project. And I'm going to name this directory stat320. You could name it whatever makes sense to you. And then you can create the project as a subdirectory of, it looks like it's defaulting to being in my documents folder. If you wanted it to be somewhere else, you could browse and look around on your computer and find the right place where you want it to be. And so then we're going to click Create Project, and RStudio is going to switch us over to that project. So now you have a project, and this is basically a folder. In my case, it's in my documents. Then I have a folder called stat320, and all that's in there right now is a .rproj file. That's the thing that gives me the preferences for this project. But I'd like you to go back to Canvas and find the lab intro.rmd. So this is a special file type which is going to work with R. And I'd like you to download it onto your computer. So it's going to ask on a Mac at least if I should open it or save it. You always just want to say save it. And then it downloads into my downloads folder. I now want to go move it from my downloads folder into that folder for stat320. So I'm going to go do that. Okay, I've now moved that file into my folder and it's visible in my RStudio files browser here, and then I can click on it, which will get another pane to open in my RStudio. So here we are. We're in this specialty document type called a .rmd, an RMarkdown document, which I'm going to talk about a lot in this class. And this is a lab where I'm going to walk you through an introduction to R and RStudio. So now we are inside RStudio. We're going to talk about R, the programming language, as well as RStudio, which is this program that we've opened up on our computer. So R is a programming language. It was developed in the 1990s with the idea of becoming an open source alternative to this language called S. It's free, it's open source, it gets developed by people all over the world. I have helped develop some R packages, and if you develop some R skills, you too could contribute to R packages. So there are lots of alternatives to this. People use Python, or Julia is another programming language that gets used for this. If you've taken another intro stat course, you might have learned Stata or Minitab or Jump, things like that. So that's kind of what R is. RStudio, again, is this program that we're within, which is going to make it easier to program in R. Back when I learned how to program in R, we didn't have a nice integrated development environment like this, and we had to use R at the command line. It was much harder, but it's gotten a lot more user-friendly with RStudio. The company RStudio develops this software package, and then they also develop some R packages, which we're going to talk more about in a minute. And they have people who work on this document format called RMarkdown. So this is a syntax for composing a document. It's a mixture of Markdown, which is just kind of a text markup language, and R codes that you can have words and code in the same document. So this is an RMarkdown document that I made for you, and you're going to learn how to make them yourself for labs. So we're going to talk about the panels in RStudio first. So we've got the panel that defaults to being in the upper right, and all of this is customizable. So if you decided that you wanted your panes to be different, you could move them around. If you don't like this black text on white background, you can change the background. I use the defaults because I think that it's the easiest so that we all kind of have the same thing going on. So typically up in the upper right is your environment. There's also, if you click the tab next to that, there's a history tab, which will show you the history of all the code you've typed. Since we're starting in a new project, I don't have any history here. There's a couple other things that we're not going to talk about in this class that are tabs. So the environment and the history are the most important up there. Then we've got this panel down here, which is on the left at the bottom. This is called the console. And when we launched RStudio, it was sort of the whole screen. That'll often happen when you open up RStudio, is you'll see the console as the whole screen. But then if you open another document, it'll get sort of schlumped down. And this is just giving me some information about the version of R that I'm running, telling me that it's free. So it'll always kind of start up with these messages. It's got this thing called a prompt, this little arrow with the blinking cursor, and this is sort of a request for you to type some R code. So we're going to be doing some typing of code at the console, and you can try it out just like seeing R like a big calculator. So if I type 2 + 2 and hit enter, it will tell me it is 4. Or I could use a function in R like log parenthesis 100 and hit enter, and it'll tell me the natural log of 100. I could use sqrt parentheses 100, and that'll tell me 10. So anything that a fancy calculator can do, R can do, but then R has many, many more functions. So that's the console. There's also a terminal tab here, which we're not going to use very much, and jobs, so you just need to focus on the console. Then there's a few more panels. So down here in the lower right, we've got the Files panel, which will default to showing you the folder that's associated with your project. So right now I can just see the files that I put in that folder. I could click around and get back to my Documents folder and get into other folders, but I want to kind of stay in this project. There's also a pane where plots will appear, a pane that shows me about the packages that I have installed. So you probably installed the tidyverse, and it looks like I actually have 2 versions of that. Hopefully you just have one, but you can see all the packages that you have installed. You could update them if you wanted to from here. There's a button to install more packages. There's help, which will help you learn about things like I was apparently learning how to install specific versions, and there's a viewer which may become relevant later. Okay, and then like we saw when we opened up the RMD, we got a 4th pane up here on the upper left, which is sort of where my file is. I'll also be able to see data there eventually. So R is this programming language. It's been around for a long time. I've been programming in R for more than 10 years now, and it comes with functions like log and square root, and absolute value. Abs of -10 is 10. But the power of R, and the reason why it's become so popular, is because anyone can write an additional package. And a package is just a bunch of R functions that all get packaged together with documentation and data sets and all kinds of good stuff put into something that you can easily install. So we're going to be using dplyr, which is like data pliers, which is going to help you wrangle your data. There's also a package called ggplot2, which is for data visualization, and that uses the grammar of graphics, which is this famous book on the theory of data visualization. So if you want to use a package, you have to install it, and you only ever have to do that one time, and you have to load it, and you have to load a package every single time you want to use it. So I'm assuming that you've already installed the packages that I listed on Canvas. If you haven't done that yet, you could copy this code and you could paste it down into your console and hit enter, and then all that red text would scroll by like you saw in my video about installation. I've already installed those, so I'm not going to run it. So we've done the thing that we only ever have to do once. So if you've already done that, you don't have to run that code. And we're going to start by doing some exploratory data analysis, or EDA. This is an idea that was created by a very famous statistician named John Tukey in the 1960s. And basically it says, before you start doing your statistics and your fancy modeling, you should look at your data. You should make some plots, you should find some summary statistics, and that'll help you avoid making silly mistakes because of problems in your data. So in order to start, we need to load some packages in so that we have access to them. There is a function in R which will load a package, and it is the library function. So library, parentheses, and then you put the name of the package inside the parentheses. There's another function that does a similar thing called require. I try and always be consistent and use library, but you might see me slipping up sometimes using require. So just so you know. And I am going to load the tidyverse, I'm going to load skimmer, and I'm going to load car. And so I could copy this code and paste it down into my console and hit enter. And then some text is going to scroll by. It's letting me know that it has, loaded in some packages and maybe there's some conflicts. This has to do with naming conventions, and it's not a problem. It's just some information. So that's one way to run the code. Another way to do it is to put my cursor on a line of code, and then on the Mac, it's Command Return, which will copy the code, paste the code, and hit enter basically for you. And again, this red stuff is actually just a message. It's telling me that it attached it and there was some masking. So that's all fine. There's a third way to run code, which is to use the green play button, which will actually run all three of the lines here that are in this gray chunk. So if I hit that play button, it'll run everything. It kind of knew that I'd already done these two, so I don't get the messages again, but then for the package car, it's telling me some information. So now, not a whole lot has happened, but I have access to more functions, which is going to be useful for me. So when we're doing statistics, we are using data, and we're often using data to make plots or summary statistics, and then we're going to move into making models. So I chose a data set about professor salaries. It comes built into R, so you don't have to download it separately. It had the right kind of number of variables, and it has to do with college professors, so it seemed kind of appropriate. So this data is already in R, so we can access it using this R function data. So we do data, parentheses, salaries, and then we close off the parentheses. So I could just type this right into my console, data, salaries, and you can see that RStudio is already suggesting things for me. So it's giving me a suggestion that I would want to finish this off by typing the rest of salaries. If I want to, I can hit the tab key, and that will complete the code for me. So it works with or without the quotation marks here, but it's just filling that in. So it's data, parentheses, quotation marks, salaries, and then we close off the quotations, close off the parentheses. And if I hit enter, and you look over in your environment pane, you should see that something has happened over here. So there's this section called values, it says salaries, and then it says promise in these kind of like triangular brackets. So R is a lazy loading programming language, which means that it's not going to do anything until it's really, really sure that it needs to. So even though I said I want to load this data in, it doesn't really believe that I want to load the data until I do something with it. So one thing that we can do is we can look at it using the str or stir function. So I could type in my console str parentheses salaries, and then I could hit enter. And so some stuff prints out in my console, but then I also see that my data has loaded in over in my environment. So there's a couple things that I could do over here. One is I can click where it says 397 obs of 6 var, and then it'll open up kind of like a spreadsheet-like version of my data that I can scroll through. So I can see that there's a variable which is rank, if someone is a professor, an assistant professor, an associate professor, the discipline they're in, the year since they got their PhD, years of service, their sex, and their salary. So when I clicked that button to get this to pop up, a line of code appeared in my console, which is view salaries. So everything that I'm doing is reproducible in terms of the code, but sometimes I can use buttons to help me see things. So that's one thing I might want to do in my environment. The other thing is to hit this little arrow, and it'll turn into a down arrow. And then I can adjust the size of these panes so I can see what's going on. This, again, it's going to tell me the names of all my variables, and then it's going to tell me what kind of variable it is. So int, that means integer, that's a number. Factor is a special variable type in R, which is a categorical variable that has a specific number of categories. So I've got a lot of useful information just from the environment. But let's go back and look at that str or stir of, and I often pronounce the parentheses of, salaries. So I could run it by clicking this play button. And then it runs the code in the console. So it says stir salaries, and that it's a data frame. It has 397 observations of 6 variables, and then it gives me a little bit of a preview of the data. This is very similar to what I could see by hitting the down arrow here. There's another function that makes the skim of the data set, so I can skim of salaries, and if I hit the play button, then I'll get a ton of information in my console. So I'm going to hit this button to make my console a little bit bigger. In my console, I'm going to hit the up arrow so that I get to the previous line of code I ran, and I'm going to hit enter again. So now I got a ton of information. I got a data summary, which has the name of the data set, the number of rows, the number of columns. Says I've got 3 factor columns, 3 numeric columns, no group variables, and then it breaks the variables down by factor and numeric. It tells me how many are missing, the complete rate, like what percentage of them are complete, is it ordered, how many unique categories are there, and then it gives me some of the top counts. So professor, 266. And I don't actually know which of these is assistant and which is associate, but something like that, because it's cutting off those labels. And then for the numeric variables, it gives me the mean, the standard deviation, the 0th quartile, the 25th, the 50th, etc. And then it makes a little histogram like that. I've realized that I probably have a preference set differently than you do. So just to head off the question that I'm guessing you have at the tip of your tongue, I'm going to show you what I have set up differently than you probably do. So I'm going to go to my RStudio and pick out my preferences, and then I'm going to get this options pane that will pop over. And let's see, I think I have this. Is it in code? No, but it looks like there's a lot of good options there. I think it might be under RMarkdown. And so you probably have a button checked here that says show output inline for all RMarkdown documents. So I've unchecked that because I like seeing the output in my console. I'll change my checkbox to the way that yours probably is, and just show you what that looks like. I'm going to say OK, and then we'll go back to my lab intro. If I click the play button now, I'm going to get that output showing right in my RMarkdown document. So we'll leave that for a minute.